In the summer of 1914, the world stood on the edge of catastrophe. For decades, Europe had been divided into two rival alliance systems. On one side, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain. On the other, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These alliances were meant to preserve balance. But in truth, they created a dangerous trap where even the smallest spark could ignite a continent-wide war. And that spark came on June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated. The killer? A young Bosnian Serb nationalist, Gavrilo Princip. The murder shocked Europe, but it was Austria-Hungary's furious reaction, backed by Germany, that pushed the continent into disaster. By the way, you're watching Beyond the Ages, where we bring you the true stories of history, told in a way you've never seen before. If you're fascinated by how a single moment can change the course of the world, then stay with us. And don't forget to subscribe, because there are many more untold stories ahead. Back in 1914, Austria issued a crushing ultimatum to Serbia when Serbia refused to accept all the demands. Austria declared war on July 28th. The alliances snapped into action. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia and soon after on France. Then came Germany's bold move, the invasion of neutral Belgium. This violation of neutrality forced Britain to join the war. Within just 1 week, Europe was in flames. Across the capitals of Europe, men rushed to enlist. In Berlin, Paris, London, and Vienna, patriotic crowds filled the streets. They sang national anthems, waved flags, and cheered their soldiers. Most believed it would be a short, glorious war. Over by Christmas, they said, but the reality was far darker. This war would not last weeks, but years. It would not take thousands, but millions of lives. In 1914, Europe stood on the brink of disaster. For decades, two powerful alliances had divided the continent. On one side, the Triple Entente, France, Britain, and Russia. On the other, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Each claimed they only wanted peace. But beneath the surface, they were preparing for war. And when the spark finally came in the summer of 1914, the world plunged into catastrophe. Germany strikes. The Schlieffen Plan. Germany had been waiting for this moment. Their strategy was ready. The Schlieffen Plan. Defeat France first, quickly, decisively. Then turn east to face Russia. To do this, German armies poured into neutral Belgium. Villages burned, defenses shattered, and columns of German troops marched relentlessly toward Paris. But this brutal invasion had an unintended consequence. Britain, outraged at the violation of Belgian neutrality, declared war. Now the greatest powers of Europe were all locked in battle. By late August, German forces clashed with the French in a savage battle of the frontiers. The French were hurled back across their own soil, exhausted, bloodied, retreating. But France was not finished, with their capital threatened. The French army, joined by Britain's small but determined force, launched a desperate counterattack. September 1914. Just outside Paris, the Battle of the Marne began. For days, men fought in fields and villages. The outcome hung in the balance. But then, in one of history's great turning points, the German advance was stopped. Paris was saved. Germany's dream of a quick victory shattered. The war stalls. Trench warfare begins. Unable to break through, German soldiers dug trenches into the earth. The Allies did the same. And so, by late 1914, the Western Front became a line of fortifications stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. The race to the sea had ended in stalemate. Now both sides stared at each other across mud, barbed wire, and endless lines of trenches. A new kind of war had begun. A war of attrition. A war of suffering. a war that would grind down millions. The Eastern Front, a different story. But in the East, the war looked very different. Russia mobilized faster than anyone had expected. Its armies surged into East Prussia, catching Germany off guard. Yet here, too, disaster struck. At Tannenberg, August 1914, German generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff encircled the Russians. Over 100,000 men were killed or captured. Unlike the trenches in the West, the Eastern Front remained mobile, armies advancing, retreating, bleeding the land white. As 1914 turned to winter, the soldiers of Europe shivered in their trenches. Rats, mud, and frostbite became as deadly as bullets. Yet morale remained strangely high. Many still believed victory was only a matter of months. That next Christmas, the war would be over. And in December, for a brief, almost miraculous moment, it seemed humanity could triumph over hatred. Along parts of the front, soldiers laid down their weapons. They sang carols. They shared food. They played football in the frozen fields. It was the Christmas truce of 1914, an unforgettable glimpse of peace in a world being torn apart. But the silence was short-lived. The guns soon roared again. By the end of 1914, Europe was trapped in a nightmare. Millions were dead or wounded. Yet the war had only just begun. No one could imagine the horrors that still lay ahead. Poison gas, mass slaughter, entire nations reshaped. The world had stepped into a war far longer and far bloodier than anyone had ever dreamed possible. And this was only the beginning. By 1915, the world had already descended into chaos. But what no one could have imagined was that the war would not be over in months. It would grind on for years. It was no longer a war of movement, but a war of survival. Nations bled, empires cracked, and millions marched into a storm from which few would ever return. Trench lines stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, an iron wall dividing Europe. Armies launch repeated offensives, but every advance is met with machine gun fire and artillery hell. Imagine charging across no man's land, only to find death waiting in every step. Germany unveils a weapon of horror, poison gas at Ypres. Green-yellow clouds drifting across the battlefield, suffocating thousands. Survivors live on, scarred forever. But even this nightmare fails to break the deadlock. Allies open a new front against the Ottoman Empire. British, French, Australians, and New Zealanders land on the beaches of Gallipoli. The plan was bold. Seize Constantinople. Open the way to Russia. Victory here could change the course of the war. But Ottoman defenses, led by Mustafa Kemal, prove unshakable. Soldiers fight on rocky cliffs, under burning sun and choking dust. Months of slaughter, and by early 1916, the Allies retreat in humiliation. Over 250,000 casualties and nothing gained. In the East, Russia hurls massive armies against Austria-Hungary and Germany. Sometimes they smash through. Sometimes they are annihilated. Losses are staggering. Hundreds of thousands in a single campaign. But every victory comes at a cost too great. Every defeat weakens the empire from within. By the end of 1915, even civilians suffer. Hunger, shortages, despair. 1916, the year of attrition. In February, Germany targets Verdun, a symbol of French pride. General Falkenhayn's chilling plan bleed France. White the battle rages for 10 months. Shells thunder day and night. Village vanish. Forests become wastelands. Men live, fight, and die in a nightmare of mud and fire. The French motorists. ILS any passeront pas. They shall not pass. By the end, 700,000 casualties. Verdun stands, but at an unimaginable cost. To relieve Verdun, the British launched the Somme offensive in July 1916. On the first day, nearly 60,000 men killed or wounded. The darkest day in British history. Endless artillery barges, waves of soldiers climbing out of trenches, cut down in moments. For 5 months, the song ground on. Millions of shells, rivers of blood, and at the end, just a few miles gained. By November, over 1 million casualties. By the end of 1916, the war is no longer about victory, but endurance. Nations bleed their youth into the mud. Families starve. Economies collapse. Empires weaken. The Great War had entered a new phase, not of swift triumphs, but of endless suffering, a struggle of who could endure the longest. And though no one knew it yet, the worst was still to come. By 1917, Europe was bleeding to death. 3 years of war had consumed millions of lives, yet the battle lines had barely shifted. Cities mourned, villages starved, and entire generations vanished in the mud of the trenches. Both alliances searched desperately for a way out of the deadlock, but every attempt only tightened the grip of war. To break Britain's lifeline of supplies, Germany turned to a ruthless weapon: unrestricted submarine warfare. Beneath the waves, U-boats stalled the Atlantic, striking without warning. Merchant ships, neutral vessels, even passenger liners, all were fair game. SFX, submarine sonar ping, torpedo launch, explosion. When a Lusitania was sent to the ocean floor in 1915, over 100 Americans perished. Outrage rippled across the United States, but America still held back for now. By 1917, however, German U-boats struck again and again, determined to starve Britain into submission. This gamble would soon awaken a giant. On land, the Western Front remained a slaughterhouse. Allied commanders launched massive offensives, hoping to finally shatter the German lines. One such attempt became infamous: the Battle of Passchendaele. Sounds of rain, sucking mud, distant bombardment. For months, men fought not only the enemy, but the very ground beneath them. The battlefield dissolved into a swamp of mud and shell craters. Horses drowned. Soldiers vanished, swallowed whole by the mire. Tens of thousands were cut down for only a handful of miles gained. It was not victory. It was endurance. An endless nightmare. Meanwhile, far to the east, the Russian Empire teetered on the edge of collapse. The war had drained it of food, fuel, and faith. In Petrograd, bread riots turned into mass protest. Soldiers mutinied. By March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated his throne, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. SFX, chanting crowds, crackling gunfire in distance. A provisional government tried to carry on the war, but the people had had enough. And in the shadows, another force gathered strength. In November, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in the October Revolution. Their promise was simple: peace, land bread. For Russia's exhausted millions, it was irresistible. Russia began negotiations to leave the war, a collapse that would unleash Germany's armies from the east, just as a new power prepared to enter from across the Atlantic. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. At first, the German generals laughed. America's army was tiny, inexperienced, but they underestimated something far greater: America's industrial might, its manpower, and its wealth. Music shift, rising hope, determination. President Woodrow Wilson framed the war not as an old struggle of empires, but as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. For weary allies, it was a promise of salvation. For Germany, it was a warning. Time was running out. But for the men trapped in the trenches of 1917, these great shifts meant little. Life was measured in rations, in cigarettes, in hours of silence before the next barrage. They lived among rats and corpses, soaked in rain, eaten by lice. Disease spread faster than hope. Every dawn carried the same question: would today be my last? Pause. Silence. Then faint whistle of incoming shell. And yet, through all the misery, a sense of change was coming. Rumors spread. Russia collapsing. America joining. Soldiers could feel it. This nightmare was moving towards something decisive. By the end of 1917, the chessboard of war looked utterly transformed. Germany prepared to unleash its full might on the Western Front, hoping to strike before American soldiers could arrive in force. Britain and France clung on, battered but unbroken. Russia descended into civil war, leaving chaos in its wake. And America was only just beginning to awaken its power. The year 1917 was not the end of the Great War, but it was the turning of the tide. From this point, the war would only grow more desperate, more brutal, more total. For millions, the suffering continued, but the balance of power had shifted forever. 1917, the year the old world began to die, and the future began to fight its way into existence. In 1918, the world had been bleeding for 4 long years. But now, with Russia collapsing and America rising, the conflict was entering its most decisive and its most desperate phase. Germany saw one last chance for victory, one final gamble before the inevitable tide swept them away. But every advance carried a cost. The Germans pushed too far, too fast. Their supplies lagged behind. Their men were starving, exhausted, bleeding. And then across the Atlantic, a new power arrived. America. Fresh divisions of American troops landed in France by the hundreds of thousands. Young, determined, untouched by the years of slaughter that had scarred Europe. At the Second Battle of Marne, the Germans struck again. But this time they were stopped. The tide had turned, and Germany knew it. Now it was the Allies' turn. With artillery, tanks, aircraft, and overwhelming manpower, the Allies pushed the Germans back, step by bloody step. The German army, once feared across Europe, was now collapsing, starving, deserting, demoralized, and the city's protests erupted, strikes spread, and whispers of revolution grew louder. Germany was not alone in defeat. The Central Powers were unraveling. Bulgaria surrendered first, then the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary fractured into pieces, torn apart by nationalist movements in Germany. The last giant, standing, finally crumbled. The Kaiser abdicated his throne and fled into exile. In his place, a fragile new republic begged for peace. And so, on the 11th of November, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. After 4 years of unthinkable slaughter, the Great War was over. But peace came at a price almost too great to comprehend. Over 16 million lives lost. Entire landscapes reduced to wastelands. Empires vanished from the map. New nations were born out of the ruins. Families shattered. Generations scarred. A world forever changed. They called it the war to end all wars. But history had other plans. The bitterness, the anger, the hunger for revenge, all of it remained. And from the ashes of 1918, a darker storm was already gathering. This was the end of the First World War, but it was only the beginning of the century's darkest chapter.